Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Game Master. Now, in today's episode, by very convincing request, we are looking at running a siege. Now, a siege, apart from being difficult to spell in my world anyway, a siege is a very complicated thing and, if done well, becomes an incredibly memorable centerpiece for a moment within your campaign, and if done rather poorly, becomes a rather bland, dull hack and slash with mediocre results. Now, a lot of you have written in saying, well, how do you make mass combat feel like it's got something to do with the players, but at the same time is not just number crunching, or it feels like it's in the background and occasionally you get a description of, oh, you can see a cluster of men fighting over there. How do you make it feel even grander, and so on? And the two are, I believe, inextricably interlinked. You cannot have a siege with only one person. Well, okay, yes, you can, but generally speaking, sieges involve hundreds or thousands of troops fighting against hundreds or thousands of people. And generally speaking, or the definition of a siege anyway, is a protracted period of time in which one army encircles another with the intent of weakening the encircled army to the point that they either surrender or are no longer capable of defending their area, and that the area that they currently hold is fairly impenetrable to the besieging army and will require heavy casualties in order to take said encircled area. So in other words, it's a central point that someone is trying to take badly and is having difficulty getting it because the bugger who's in the middle is tenacious and just won't let go. So how do we now hold that? Now, sieges are not simply restrained or restricted to science fiction, to fantasy. They are, of course, available in any genre. You can have a siege of a office block, you can have a siege of a starship or a base space station, and so on and such forth. So when we are talking about sieges, just bear in mind we are talking about sieges in general. Now, this also, unfortunately, has to be a multi-part series, so we'll see how that progresses. We are going to take a little bit of a break because next week I am off to Japan, and I have to say a big thank you to all of my fans who are in Japan at the moment and who are frantically organizing things for me. I think it's going to be an absolutely amazing time, and I hope to bring you some valuable lessons from Japan on how we can improve our game by going and exploring different cultures and looking at just different ways of gaining inspiration to make our games just that much better. And hopefully not getting shot too often with the airsoft competition that we're going to be participating in, or cut to death by samurai. Anyway, it promises to be an exciting 2 weeks. And I look forward to bringing you stuff from Japan. So things may look a little bit different for the next 2 weeks from next week. But rest assured, the siege information will continue. So this is part 1. And like any good siege, or any warfare as a matter of fact, the very first thing that we need to do is we need to prepare. So this is part 1, preparing to siege. Now, this is one point where, unlike most of the other scenarios and situations that I usually describe or talk about, it's where I myself need to sit down and actually do some good, solid preparation. And the reason for it is because the more information you have about what's going to go on in the siege and what's happening in the siege, the better and more realistic the siege will feel, and the longer you can make it run for. If you're making up stuff on the fly, unless you are very experienced at keeping a whole lot of things running at the same time and in making up things that seem interlinked when they are investigated and explored, you're going to struggle with your siege to make it feel as if it really is an entrapped situation. So we're going to look at a whole lot of different things as we go through this series of siege warfare, and that ultimately will lead on to mass combat warfare, and we'll take it as we go. So when we look at the very first thing that we need to do, now this is before we look at the actual narrative, believe it or not, this is before we look at all of those things. What we're going to start off with is we're going to start off with a layout of the surrounding areas of the place being besieged. Whether it's a castle or a building or a space station, what is the area around the castle in, say, a 10-mile or 10,000 kilometer or 1 kilometer radius? Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why we need to establish this first. Now, if you look at certain castles that were built during the medieval era, one of my favorite castles is a castle called Caractère Chevalier, and Caractère Chevaliers, if I'm pronouncing it properly, and I hope I am, Caractère Chevaliers was a castle that had a phenomenal little design in terms of having a right-angled entrance, so you couldn't get a battering ram up to the door. Now, this confounded a lot of their besiegers, and eventually the castle was taken not by force and not by besiege, but by the aggressive army just saying, we've got more people than you and you're going to eventually die, you might as well give up. And the opposing force going, oh, all right, that's okay then, we give up. And so they left. But why did they actually give up? Was it an intimidation factor? Well, some people claim that it was, but on the other hand, you look at the situation, you look at the surrounding areas, and it starts to make a little bit more sense. Now, the surrounding areas are what are important in determining just how long the siege could feasibly maintain for, as well as giving you a whole lot of information and clues as to potential storylines that you can then inculcate or incorporate into your plan for your entire siege. Now, here's an example of a siege. Let's just go there, for example. And if we look at a fortification that was built in the caldera of an ancient volcano, the volcano is long since dormant. We don't have lava flowing around and that sort of thing. But the fortification is built in the bowl of the caldera with the outer walls, which have now been broken down through time, so they look more like a set of jagged dentures left lying around than anything else. And that in turn is surrounded by mountain ranges and things, but it's a decent open plain all around the little town fortification with its little hill, so it commands quite a nice presence. Now, if that little town had 14,000 soldiers inside of it, and they had positions on all of those hills surrounding the town, that's a pretty defensible situation, isn't it? But because there are hills further out, also encircling the town, and the enemy of 20,000 take up position, and they also have all sorts of defensive capabilities, that makes it rather difficult to get out of that siege. So here we have a siege where it's not because the aggressors overnumber, it's not because the aggressors control so much of the territory, it's because the territory is so difficult to actually get out of that the besiegers are, well, the siege people are stuck, the besiegers themselves are also stuck because they can't progress forward because of the defenses, and they can't let up because then the people inside will get out. Now, that siege in the middle of a volcano caldera, or the area around that anyway, is a siege from a battle here in South Africa called the Siege of Ladysmith, which was so tragic and so dark that the British Empire labelled it Black Monday, because at the same time 2 other sieges were happening elsewhere in South Africa, which I won't go into details because they're passions of mine, obviously, but all of them involved slightly larger, poorly trained forces that were very good crack shots but very poor at sieging, taking 3 positions, 3 towns at the same time: Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Bloemfontein. Now, not Bloemfontein, Kimberley. I tell a lie. Kimberley, what was interesting about Kimberley was that the besiegers didn't know what to do. Those stuck inside the town had 1 cannon, and the only thing that they could fire was spoons, knives, and forks, which they did with aplomb, which kept the besiegers out rather than allowing them to take it in, and that resulted in all sorts of crazy things happening. Nonetheless, the idea is our caldera-based town. Now, the geography is so important. Now, with Kimberley, it's fairly flat. Well, with Mafeking, it's completely flat. So at that point, your besiegers can see into the town and the people in the town can see out. But because there's no sort of cover whatsoever, no one can make progress. With Ladysmith, the terrain is so rocky and hilly, trying to run is almost impossible. And the amount of times that I came a cropper just walking carefully over, let alone trying to dodge flying bullets and attack a hill at the same time, is incalculable. So the surrounding area is very important. What sort of fields are there? Are they open fields? Are they planted fields? Are there lots of access roads? Is there only one access road? Is it on the side of a mountain? Or is it on the side of a seaside cliff? And the only approach is from one side. Unless, of course, you're Alexander the Great and you're attacking Athens, and then you just cut your own staircase from the sea floor up onto the top of the cliff, and bingo, you've overcome a natural obstacle and built a nice staircase at the same time. So the geography around your besieged thing is important. If it's in space, are there nearby nebula, natural phenomenon, gravity wells? Is there a cluster of dark matter which could interrupt communications? How does it work? Now, the geography is also important in terms of what can it sustain. So in a science fiction environment where food is very seldom taken into consideration, one doesn't necessarily need to harvest the local resources to maintain the siege. In a fantasy setting, however, local resources become important, and we often forget about logistics and supply chains and the phenomenal amount of effort that needs to go into feeding a besieging army. Now, this has come into play in the past where, for example, imagine, if you will, a small castle which is besieged by a significantly larger force but is protected by a moat, and the only entranceway is through a sort of a boggy patch of terrain, so it's difficult for the encircling army to advance. However, the army within starts to run out of food. So what do? They send the men and, well, they send the infirm, women and children out of the gates in the hopes that the encircling army will take compassion on them and feed them. The encircling army, however, also has run out of food and sees the approaching hungry hordes as a threat to their continued survival. So they try and force them back. Only now those in the center of the siege don't want those people back because they were getting rid of them because they didn't have any food, and they suspect that it might be a trap. So those poor people end up stuck in the middle, literally besieged within a siege, and eventually starved to death. Now, of course, that's absolutely horrendous. Wonderful narrative and wonderful story and great tragedy and drama. And that happened not just once, but that was certainly an experience that Julius Caesar had when he was taking over Gaul and the upper parts of Germania or Germanica. And that's literally what happened. The people got stuck in between. They couldn't move backwards or forwards, and so they literally starved to death. Absolutely horrid story. But the geography was the factor there, not so much any of the other stuff, which we're going to get to. So work out the geography critically. Is there only one river? In which case, maybe you'll try and do what the guys in the Siege of Ladysmith did. If we dam the river that flows through the town will eventually be flooded, and that will wash out the opponents. Well, building a dam takes longer than it does to conduct a siege, and building a good dam to do that kind of damage took even longer. And of course, that never happened. So, well, it never completed happening, let's put it that way. So the geography is really important and just gives you so much opportunity for narrative, so much opportunity for stories where, the players have to go out and try and knock down the dam that's being built, or this or that. It's absolutely lovely. So look at the geography that's around the structure that is being besieged. Next step, of course, is a map of the structure. Now, again, I have done videos where it's maps on the fly, and ordinarily that would suffice. But in the case of a siege is a very tactical space. It's a very, very, very intrinsically battle map type of space, and we have battle maps from sieges where we've seen what people have tried to do. Now, this requires you to make very, very complicated maps so that you have that all at hand for when the players invariably start to do this. Just as a side note now, I'm assuming that the players are involved in the siege in some kind of higher echelon space. They're either commanding it or they are working for someone who's directly linked to it. They're not just people within the siege. Then, of course, things change and you look more at mass combat than you do at preparing for a siege. So wait for that video. This is about the PCs being in a position where they have some kind of influence over the outcomes of this siege. Now, they need a map. They need a detailed map. And part of that detailed map is they need to know a lot of different things. Now, part of the map that I'm including here, and I mean, it's winter and we've got a thunderstorm outside. Nobody knows what's going on. Perhaps there's someone controlling the weather. Who knows? Who knows? So much chaos and confusion. Well, the GM knows, and the GM should have some good notes, such as, what are the stores like? Is there a lot of food? Is there a little bit of food? Are we going to go down to half rations, quarter rations? Is it going to be an apple a day or a loaf of bread a day? Is it going to get a point where we need to take all of the horses because a cavalry in a siege is really no good unless you're trying to break out? Are we going to take those horses and are we going to melt them, or kill them, cut them up and just melt them down into a grey goo, which will end up being called chevril? Again, this is from the Siege of Ladysmith. And side note, I'm quite proud of my great-grandfather who was involved. He owned his horse, and when the order was given to execute horses and turn them into this grey paste, akin to something like Bovril or Vegemite, he did not accept that as an outcome. He was ordered to execute his horse, of course, which he then did as a loyal soldier, but he refused to eat any of it that was produced. As a result, the rest of his troops took pity on him for not having any food, and they gave him all of their chocolate that had been given to them by Queen Victoria, because that's what you do during a siege. Now, obviously, everybody else enjoyed his horse, and the subsequent postage stamp glue was very effective at sending letters to the loved ones back home. Now, that's an aside. So, what are the stores like, and what's going to happen when those stores run out? What is the alternative? Are we going to turn to bird seed from the level? How are we going to feed people once it runs out? And that's one of the things that you have to have. You have to know that in order to be able to make the stakes of your game high. Now, ultimately speaking, there's two ways to go generally in a siege. The one way is we have very little stores, and within the week we will have run out and we're going to have to make some tough decisions. The alternative is, well, we can last out for about 5 years. That's a lot of resources, and especially in like a science fiction game where you have space stations that are designed to be self-reliant, their stores are going to run out very, very slowly. Battlestar Galactica is a good example where they had lots of stores until things started to go wrong. And there's the key to that. Where things starting to go wrong is where you start to remove those stores, and there's an adventure hook, isn't it? Someone's sabotaging the stores. Find out who they are. Or we need to replenish the stores. Or there's a merchant who has stores and he was selling them to the public at exorbitant costs, which always happens, by the way. Or there's this going on. Or the PCs are hired to go and steal the flour from the king, because why does he need to eat cake all the time? I mean, let's just start a revolution. So stores are important. Now, equally important is the water. Water is critically important. How much water is there? Is it clean water? Is it fresh water? Is it drawn from a source? And can that source be attacked by the enemy? Do they know about it? And if they know about it, how are they going to attack it? Are they going to poison it, drain it, dirty it? Maybe they're going to use it as a point of entry. Maybe they're going to, in a fantasy setting, throw a water elemental in there to attack the town from within. If it's water supplies in space, is there just no oxygen and hydrogen that they can combine? Are they introducing maybe a different type of hydrogen molecular construct that causes the hydrogen molecules to spontaneously drop an electron or gain an electron or turn into something else? How are they trying to sabotage that water supply? And water should be very, very critical. Then, what are the troops within that siege? How are the troops arrayed? How many of them are there? How well trained are they? What sort of equipment do they have? How many arrows do they actually have? Can they use murder holes to kill the opposing forces? Do they have enough arrows? Is there a Fletcher who can make more? Does he have enough wood? Are there enough chickens running around to make the flight feathers? What are the available resources? Are there healing potions? Are there phaser arrays? Are there torpedoes? Are there more torpedoes? Do we have even more torpedoes? All of those kind of things come down to the troops and the defenses, which you have to obviously explore and look at. Now, in the case of defenses, if it's defenses, the enemy might try and attack specifically those defenses. If you look at the attack on Minas Tirith, though not technically a siege because it was simply an all-out assault to take the castle, town, village, city, whatever you want to call it. Well, not village, but castle. You get the idea. Citadel. You get the idea. The idea there was that they attacked all of the things that were attacking them back. They hit those first. And of course, in a siege, you've got flying things, which means we wouldn't really use traditional medieval castle-style construction. We'd have all sorts of other things that we build to defend against aerial attack. But most of us use traditional medieval castles because it looks cooler. So how would you defend those towers, and how would you protect them from aerial attack, and how would the enemy try and attack them? Obviously, in the case of space, how many rail guns do they have? What's their torpedo complement? And how can those be sabotaged or attacked to reduce the efficacy of the station's resistance? If you look at Stargate Atlantis, the whole series was effectively a siege until they started to take the battle to the Wraith. And in that siege, they were running out of power because they had lots of shields, and then they had lots of food, and then they had lots of water, and then they were running out of that, and they were running out of this, and then they didn't have enough ammunition, and then their ZPM or ZPM just kept stopping, and it was all sorts of drama. for lovely, lovely 5 seasons of a fantastic show, which I like very much. Now, aside from that, so what are the troops like? What are the defenses like? What's the morale like? What's the armor like? All those kinds of questions. Then we move on to what are the rooms like? Are there rooms that can be closed off to create smaller spaces? Are there rooms that can be used to create murder holes or murder spaces where the enemy has to come around a corner and you can array an entire line of phasers and just blast the enemy and there's no ways they can get around the corner without being hit by these things? The rooms become important. Now, the reason why the rooms become important is what we're going to cover in the next video when we get back from Japan. And in the next video, we will be looking at how the people are involved. And when I say how the people are involved, I mean how are your player characters involved? Because all too often, sieges and siege-like combat and mass combat falls apart when you realize that within your party, you've got a medical doctor. What is she going to do during a siege? Oh, she's going to go and heal people. Well, that's exciting. While the warrior stands on the ramparts, hacking and slashing and having a good old time. What's the thief going to do whilst the siege is going on? He's not going to be fighting. She's not going to be running around stealing food from other people. Well, maybe initially, but once that runs out, then what's she going to do? They're not combat characters. So the whole idea is how do you then design your siege to start making use of the individual characters that are most likely to be comprised of the party that you are running the game for? Now you've prepped, you've got your castle or your space station or your building or whatever it is, you've got the troops inside, you've got the defenses, you've got the rooms, you know everything that you need to know about that space, and you've got the geography around it. In other words, the structure is now all there. Now we need to work on the people. And that, like I said, is something that we will look at in several weeks' time when I'm back from Japan. I hope this has given you some insight into the beginnings of how to lay a siege, but my lord, like all great sieges, it just takes a little bit of time and planning in order to come right and get it started. And of course, once it's started, it then takes a little bit of time to get it to finish, doesn't it? But then that's the point of the siege. So there we are. Sieges. Very interesting narrative point if done well, very dull if not. Until next time, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, join us if you haven't already. And of course, you can become a Patreon and come and discuss all sorts of interesting things on Facebook. And of course, we've got Patreons now who are running games for each other and linking up through Facebook and through the channel as a result of that, which is great because it's like-minded people coming together. And I think it's absolutely wonderful. So until next time, happy sieging.